Hello, welcome everybody to our second Architectural Humanities book talk. I'm Daniel Ryan and I'm coming to you from Gadigal land. Firstly, wish to recognize and pay respect to the elders and communities, past, present and future of the lands on which our event takes place. For thousands of years, the elders and communities have shared and exchanged knowledges across innumerable generations for the benefit of all. So, we're thrilled to welcome Eva Díaz, who's Professor of Contemporary Art History at Pratt Institute in New York, and she'll be discussing her new book, After Spaceship Earth, Art, Techno-Utopia, and Other Science Fictions, just published by Yale University Press. We're also very grateful to have Lee Stickells join us as a respondent. For those who don't know Lee is Deputy Dean at the Sydney School of Architecture, Design and Planning. The talk is being recorded and will be available on Architecture, Design and Planning's YouTube channel in coming days. So over to you, Eva.
Thank you, Daniel, and thanks for having me. I'm going to share my screen. I think I need to send a request again. Let's see. All right, there we go. Let me get it up, and here we go.
That's great.
Okay. So this book comes out of a previous book that I wrote called The Experimenters about Black Mountain College, which was an arts educational institution in Western North Carolina in the southeastern part of the United States that existed from 1933 to 1957. And Buckminster Fuller was one of the sort of infamous professors there. He first arrived in 1948 and tried to erect a geodesic dome and failed, and came back the next year and succeeded in erecting a dome that he had previously erected at the Pentagon. So that's one of the tensions that the first part of this book goes into in terms of contemporary artists dealing with the legacy of Fuller. And what I felt in that first book on Black Mountain, and Fuller was about a third of the book. I also focused on Joseph Albers and John Cage and different models of experimentation in their teaching and their work. But I felt like I came down really hard on Fuller in a way that, critiquing his technocratic utilitarianism in particular, and the kind of, just sort of teleological hope that technology will miraculously solve all the world's problems, and in particular kind of cybernetic use of computers would do that. So at the time that I began or sort of gestating this current project, I was a full-time curator and I was seeing a lot of art in artist studios in New York City. And when I mentioned that I had, was working on Fuller and was doing the research at Stanford and around various locations where his papers were, I almost immediately found myself receiving a kind of joy of artists just really, happy to talk about Fuller, and really inspired in particular by his really egalitarian vision of being able to feed, house, and clothe the world's population with an equitable distribution of the world's resources. And that's something that I, noted too in my first book, but just the way that that provided tools and provides tools for artists and designers today was something that was really evident to me in those conversations with artists. So this book, in its very early moments came out of first thinking about the geodesic dome and its legacy. And then the first half of the book is called Terrestrial, and it takes up four different chapters, four different ways in which, in particular, the geodesic dome has been, sort of like metabolized by artists. So one of which is the kind of the nomadic possibility of the dome as a kind of solution to housing crises. Another one is as a kind of information display kiosk hybrid for exhibitions, some of them sort of official sponsorship of governments and museums, and some of them more ad hoc constructions on the part of artists and different collectives. For example, Occupy Wall Street often use the dome as a sort of hub. Another chapter focuses on the sort of, again, the Pentagon, Black Mountain College nexus of like the reception of Fuller by both the counterculture and his greatest patronage by the US military, particularly in the form of radomes, which are really a sort of offshoot of one of Fuller's companies in the 1950s that garnered a lot of commissions from the US military for remote Arctic outposts that were essentially a kind of surveillance net, the DEW line, it was called, DEW, to warn for Soviet missile attacks. And so the way in which even today the dome, for example, in the Snowden revelations about NSA wiretapping, those hubs are radomes in Menwith Hill in England as one major site, and you know that kind of like checkered legacy of the silhouette of the geodesic dome as being something that's related to governmental and corporate surveillance today. And another chapter deals with psychedelia and the reception, in particular by counterculture figures related to Drop City in the 1960s, that were really making parallels between the kind of cranial planetaria notion of the dome and also the kind of interior ways of changing one's mind, or like blowing one's mind, basically, in the sort of way in which like drug culture and psychedelia coalesced in a particular moment in the late 1960s, and sort of with the ways in which that had other offshoots in terms of the reception of Fuller with the Whole Earth catalog and various forms of sort of thinking about personal transformation and its links to social transformation. And the dome is a kind of a key model for that actuating. So that's the first half of the book. I'm not going to show you images related to that stuff because I wanted to focus on the second half, which is called Extraplanetary, and it deals much more with the way in which Fuller's legacy has been received in terms of the issues today around the privatization of outer space exploration, the possibility of space colonies, and the problems of that, and the problems literally of the language of colonization, which is so unresolved, as your land acknowledgement hints at in our contemporary society. And so, as you see here in this image, the sort of Spaceship Earth, which is the title of one of Fuller's books from the late 1960s, and was also coined by him as early as the early 1950s, this phrase Spaceship Earth. But this way in which the kind of problem of a model of a technological planet and artificial ecologies is taken up by artists. So, when you think about this metaphor of Spaceship Earth, it really imagines, the Earth as this human construction, a spaceship, right? And that we can possibly junk it and have Spaceship Mars or Spaceship Europa. And so this way in which an autogenetic sense of humans creating ecologies is critiqued by artists. And this is not something unique to Fuller. He was very much a man of his time in this kind of thinking, again, of a sort of technocratic fascination with how technology was going to sort of make the world a better place. That is a utopian, fantasy from the 19th century, at least on. But the ways in which this particular formation around an artificial human-created ecology, we, or at least in my book, I argue that has a lot of problems. And so this is just one image I'm showing you here of a kind of famous plan of sort of spheres floating as though these kind of geodesic artificial planets above a kind of rocky Marsscape. But oh, now I can't forward my slides. Let me escape and try. I think I might have to go slide by slide or something. Let me see. Okay. Oh, there, I can move it. Okay. So one important corrective to this that many contemporary artists and some designers are taking up is the potential of thinking Afrofuturism as the kind of Janus face to this, I guess you could say like a white technocratic utopianism, to sometimes a more dystopian vision of why to leave Earth. So a figure like Sun Ra, this planet is doomed. But his idea really of the middle passage, the shipping of slaves from Africa to the at first the British and Spanish colonies, as a kind of already a project of alien abduction, basically, and of genetic mutation and modification. So already a kind of like horror of a future that came to pass. And one thing that's important, I think, to note about Sun Ra is that the way in which Afrofuturism is disrupting models of space and time, because for Sun Ra and his cosmology, he already successfully had traveled in space. Interplanetary travel was his past, and it was a future that white scientists wanted to steal from him. So it's this kind of like inversion of the typical narrative of Africa as a primitive society. Instead, the orchestra, his band, and his whole sort of community, had this sophisticated technology and was willing to rapture the African American population to Saturn to escape white supremacy. And then another model of George Clinton, Parliament and Parliament P-Funk, Funkadelic as a kind of mothership. So perhaps less pessimistic than Sun Ra, but to think about, the potential to move in space, not as an escape necessarily from Earth, but as this sort of notion of like the brood moving with the mothership's permission or the mothership's sort of authorization. So the mother as an important, way to think of this. So rather than, let's say, spaceship Earth, we would have mothership Earth. And in a way, that's what I conclude with in the book, is to sort of see, what we can do with this, with an alternative to this technological language. So some of the artists, and I only have a few minutes left, some of the artists that I take up are looking at this Afrofuturist history. Two separate artists, Christina de Medel and also Francis Bodomo, take up the history of the Zambian Space Agency, created in 1963 to try to get to space. So, asking why is it only that rich white countries are having these space programs? Why can't we go to space too? So they petitioned to have funds from the UN. Very little was granted to them, if anything, but they created a kind of pageantry around creating this sort of like community of space travelers. And these artists are returning to those models. And I think it's important to think about, a lot of what we're talking about when we're talking about space is, is a fantasy. And that's an important fantasy in terms of how, utopia models potentials, and dystopia too, about how our future can and should be. And I think one thing that we should always consider, especially in this era of growing conservatism, I'm speaking the situation in the United States and specifically, but also of course in other regions too, is that one thing that I think is important is that it's not so much whether we're utopian or dystopian, but to really counter the moves toward, let's say, anti-utopianism, to use Frederick Jameson's phrase about that, which is trying to foreclose the potential to think the future at all, to be accepting of the way things are, and to abdicate as an individual, as a community, that hope and also those fears about the way the future is. So I think sometimes some of these projects are sort of noted to be more dystopian or more fantastical, and not utopian. Of course, one person's utopia might be another's dystopia, but it's important to occupy those spaces of imagination, which is why I use the phrasing of science fiction in my subtitle as the way in which visual culture presents a certain kind of fantasy. Fiction, of course, has a literary reference, but like what we can call speculative art or speculative projects about that. So I think that we'll just leave it there, because of course, the book has covers almost 50 living artists, and there was 150 images reproduced in the book. A great mental expense to myself, real expense. So it's a lavishly illustrated book with many projects discussed over 8 chapters. So just to give you a little teaser, I guess. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Eva. I'll hand over to Lee Stickells to respond.
Okay, thanks, Daniel. Thanks, Eva. Yeah, as you say, Eva, that is just a little snippet. And for those who haven't been able to engage with the book yet, which I'm guessing is not going to be anyone, because the release date is imminent, I think. if it's out at the moment, then it's probably not in a shop near
Out
us.
in the US as of the beginning of this month, but globally.
Yeah. So point being that I can confirm that it is indeed lavishly illustrated. The number of projects that are dealt with is, it's super impressive. But it gives a richness to the discussion that's really useful and important. And as someone myself whose work has taken them into particularly looking at that moment, that psychedelic moment, as you talk about, of that reception of Fuller in the 60s and 70s, particularly in the counterculture, and also having noticed the take up within artist work more recently, I was still overwhelmed and impressed by kind of how pervasive that influence has been, how much has been taken up by contemporary artists. So that said, I think the focus is in contemporary art, but for this audience, I think the book is still really relevant. That architectural dimension is a really strong context to it, and we know that Fuller's legacy is still very, very visible in architectural culture as well. So I think I'd say the book is a really great complement to the work of people like Felicity Scott and Mark Wigley and others who have dealt with Fuller's legacy more directly in architectural terms. So I think the book is very useful, not just in terms of historical accounting, but because of that ongoing relevance to understanding and questioning this, what's become almost an everyday embedding of references to Fuller, the technologies that he spruiked, but also that utopian thinking, that teleological, techno-optimistic thinking as well. And again, particularly by architects, we'd be familiar with it in architectural culture, that people like Norman Foster asking you how much your building weighs. It's part of the sort of bedrock of a very techno-optimistic modernism that we still live with. Anyway, so one to start to get to some questions. So yeah, again, just to point out why people should go read this book, or just look at the book at the very least. Visual feast. So a question that I had, so as you point out, like the first half of the book is much more directly, I guess, engaged in architecture, because it speaks to that taking up of particularly the geodesic dome as a technical tool, but also form that's been resonant in many ways over time. But actually, I think to bring our attention to the second half of the book was really useful this morning, because that Spaceship Earth thinking is perhaps more relevant in our current moment to perhaps reflect on in terms of architectural culture. But the first question I wanted to put to you was, in the introduction, you talk about that artists' explorations of Fuller's influence perhaps surpass the treatment he currently receives in architectural quarters. And I don't disagree with you on that, but I'd be interested to hear more from you about why you think that is, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, and probably I think it's one I answer in different ways related to the way that the dome in particular, has these kind of, tendrils that live in our present. And it really was one of the rare democratic architectural forms of the 20th century and into the 21st century, meaning that people felt that there was some purchase and sort of like literally that they could build it, and that it both connected to like a physical reality of their own construction, but also a reality of like a future, that they were building their own future. Like this wasn't traditional post and lintel architecture, it's latticed tensegrity potentially, meaning that it's continuous tension, discontinuous compression. So this kind of innovation of Fuller's and how he made a spherical structure. But I think for the second half, the way in which I think artists in particular are taking up capsule ecologies and the fraught nature of that, and the, I mean, for example, it's like, we have, I mean, everything in space is architecture. Everything in space is infrastructure. There's just like, you are in a completely vulnerable situation. I mean, it's like, but it's like a really kind of extreme architecture, right? It's like, like polar architecture. In fact, Connie Samaras, and you're looking at her picture here of Spaceport America, which is a Norman Foster construction, a boondoggle that was constructed by taxpayers in the New Mexico desert in the American Southwest, basically for Elon Musk and Richard Branson's like very cheap leases of it. And just to imagine who's going to be this this sort of astronaut of the future, the problem of space tourism as one of elites, and also, really the kind of administered life of the astronaut, which is in our culture somewhat becoming synonymous in a libertarian fashion with freedom. As though like freedom of the earth, the shackles of the earth will make you, free. So it's that kind of weird neoliberalism, libertarianism of space that these folks like Bezos, here's Bezos, and Musk, are proposing to us, but it's essentially a monetary, requirement. You have to be really rich to go to space. And if it's going to be a sort of golden lifeboat, I think it's interesting that artists are imagining those futures in specific ways where sometimes architects are actually being commissioned to make these spaces. So that's always the kind of problem of architecture too, as you all know, is that it's got a close relationship to capital. And the the sort of like expense of these projects, something like Spaceport America, have kind of ethical, somewhat ethically dubious ends, shall we say. Whereas I think for artists, there's less at stake. But then artists like Trevor Paglen, I'll show you this just as like an aestheticization of space. And this is an aestheticization of space. And I'll explain what I mean by that, which is, this is a project by Trevor Paglen where he's making non-functional satellites, meaning things that will be only an aesthetic and that we will see as they burn up and as they come back to the atmosphere. And he actually did have one of these scheduled to be launched, but during COVID, it was canceled, and it was commissioned by the Nevada Art Museum. So, to have space as something that we're constructing things that don't, that don't just satisfy like space mining, space tourism, and colonization ends, which is where we're really at with these white tech billionaires' fantasies of space studying, right? So perhaps we all have a role in like rethinking space, maybe as something that's like merely like an aesthetic thing, and in the best sense of the word, aesthetic in its root in the Greek meaning of the senses, something that like activates like the sense, and maybe in a pleasurable way, as opposed to this kind of aestheticization of space, which is, this is just like one of those so-called vomit comet, the parabolic flights. But, like this is the kind of guest, of like space travel today. And, we have more and more space tourism happening. And these are, rates of 300,000 to 500,000 a head, and wealthy people, billionaires and their guests, So anyway, to give you two avenues in the way in which art is pursuing, some interesting other ones besides, kind of handmade into capital.
Yeah. And I think that, again, that's a really useful and powerful contribution of the book, is the way that these projects that you've put together, you've assembled here, really foreground these issues. Like, so yeah, astronauts become not just astronauts, but now we understand, there are going to be, or one future is there are going to be different classes of astronaut with different conditions available to them, because because this is all constructed, and now this is all heading towards a much more privatized future. And the projects that you assemble really explore that in a way that I guess is in a blunt way, not open to architects necessarily. And I think, to pick up, I guess, on another strand in the book, to maybe extend that question, the last chapter on the mothership projects by Didier. How would you say the surname?
John Didier.
Didier. That really tackle that, as it's put, I think it's Linda Sargent Wood, you know, that faith in technological progress that we see around us that looks towards, quoting, naturalizing technology and technologizing nature. And this is like a very urgent kind of query, I guess, not just within artistic culture, but architectural culture as well. Like, how do we grapple with that kind of teleology that's at work? And the space debate kind of reflects back on how we are managing, there's that metaphor, managing the earth that we live on, that we share.
Yeah, I think it's Dawn Didier. I know her, but you know, in New Orleans they say charters instead of Chartres. So I think it's just a New Orleansification of a French name. Yeah, but that's such a good point in terms of, you know, what I mean, technologies are supposed to be tools, right, to help us. But I feel like they're truncheons often that abuse us, right? I mean, we're in a situation where something like the internet is like an environment. It's not a tool anymore. It's like we just can't escape it. It's like sucking the air out of our lives. And also just to think about something like air, you know, I have a project that I'm working on now that's a book about non-visual senses, and breath, for example, is a big part of, you know, and in a way it's like trying to take, you know, this sort of like extraplanetary down to the molecular, right? Because everything in space is going to be, again, like a kind of infrastructure or an architecture, but it's a one that, you know, not to repeat myself, but it's a very vulnerable one. And the astronaut is going to be like an administered body that is utterly reliant on technology. And we have the plenitude of nature provided to us free that we didn't author. But I think that's sort of like, again, part of that autogenetic anxiety is that like, if we don't create it and control it, then, you know, it's like, and we don't know exactly when the sun is going to expire, like we have to have this exit strategy. It's like all of these fears and anxieties that basically have little to do with reality, but, you know, and also have sort of mutated our relationship to technology into something that, you know, is less a tool and more, you know, more of like bludgeoning us with like the way we need to move into the future, which it gets into that technocratic logic that, you know, what about the dissenters, right? You know, the Luddites or something. They, you know, they'd get left behind on these the golden lifeboats, or, you know, because there's also the problem of the scorched earth, you know, model of the exit strategy. And exit strategy is something that these new spacers, meaning people who want to go into space in a privatized way, these new spacers, you know, use this exit strategy, but it's also like exit of capital, you know, like how to make money in space, but also exit of people in this way that's like about an anxiety of the scorched earth, you know, which is like, instead of having, as you said, a holistic or sort of like a you know, like some form of stewardship of the planet, it becomes just, you know, accentuate the logic of extraction, you know, which is like total ruination, and then just leave.
Yeah. And then, yeah, to go back to your point, that's where these Afrofuturist, ecofeminist futurings are important for working against that kind of anti-utopianism. I think there was a question in the chat, Daniel.
Yeah, I just see,
take that with 2 minutes to go?
Yep. So Warwick's mentioned here in relation to Spaceship Earth, I wonder whether there's any discussion in your book or through artists of Cold War links, containment, and connection to cybernetics, cyber theory, systems theory.
I missed the first part, connection to, there's something
sorry, the connections to cybernetics, cyborg theory, and systems theory.
Yeah, particularly in the first half, and specifically related to the work of artists like Paglin and also Hito Stero, who are dealing with surveillance, in particular cybernetics, forms a big part of that discussion in terms of ways of imagining, you know, computers anticipating, you know, certain events in terms of nuclear defense. But it's not a particular focus of the book, cybernetics per se. I'm really interested in that stuff, but it's actually been very well covered by writers like Fred Turner, who's at Stanford, who's done from the counterculture to the cyber culture. I forget the name, full title, blanking on the second part, but he's written quite nicely on those issues of Fuller's relation to like, let's say, Silicon Valley. And there's some really great books about that stuff. I recommend Andrew Kirk's Counterculture Green is really good. And then also the What the Dormouse Saw, John Markoff, I believe. That one is really good about this kind of way in which like a certain 1950s cybernetic conversation turned into personal computing and the problems of that, mediated by the whole Earth Council in a way. So yeah, but thank you for the question.
And I think what I just followed up with also just wondering about Cold War doctrines or containment.
Yeah, and that was really the stage. I mean, not to go into the weeds, but my fourth chapter is all about this issues of surveillance and the military, and so the SAGE system, which was designed to work as the kind of information gathering for the defense early warning line, the DEW line, is really this kind of the origins of it's the origins of the internet, ARPANET, and ways to communicate about in that case like a predicted catastrophe. So these are like, and there's again many of the writers that I just mentioned have worked on that relationship of like the sense of communication to catastrophe, and the need of cybernetics at all, like why do we need it? And the ways in which like these complex computing was essentially a kind of mapping of the Earth in terms of like futures of total war in the Cold War.
Thanks. I think we might put a virtual round of applause for Eva and Lee has responded to. And thanks so much for sharing information about your book. It's an amazing achievement. I've popped a link as well there, so if people want to follow up and get it, I know the library here at Sydney, I think, has it on order. And also look out for the recording on YouTube. And please join us next week at 5 p.m. Sydney time for discussion with John MacArthur and Martin Lee Foog on John's new book, Is Architecture Art? Thank you so much.
What a
Thank
segue.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you, Lee.
Thanks, Eva. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.